So Gary, how does entrepreneurship education have to change?
It's got to change in a number of ways, Yogi. But the primary thing is, I think, that we need to stop thinking of entrepreneurship in a binary way. You either are an entrepreneur or you're not. And we're now living in a world where everyone needs to learn how to think like an entrepreneur, so we need to understand entrepreneurship beyond just the startup world, right? These are entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills are the very skills that employers also demand.
So a few months ago, you'd invited me to a course that you were facilitating in Texas, and it was all about entrepreneurial mindset development for educators. And you said something really interesting there. You said if we want to teach all kids about entrepreneurship, we've got to define it in a way that invites more of them into the conversation. So how do you go about doing that?
Right. So that's a great question, Yogi. I think, to start with, we have to stop looking at it as a business discipline and look at it more as a behavioral phenomenon. Like, why is this small subset of the population behaving in this way, right? While the majority are not. So I think when we try to understand entrepreneurship as a business discipline, that creates sort of a bounded rationality that prevents us from really understanding what it actually is. And so, let's use this often cited definition of entrepreneurship from Howard Stevenson at Harvard. And he described it as the pursuit of opportunity without regard for resources currently controlled, something like that. It's a little bit clunky, but you get it. So from there, I want to think of it as an opportunity discovery process, right? And so because when you look at what entrepreneurs are actually doing, that's what they're doing. It's a very, organismic process. It's like an organism searching for a connection with its environment, right? And so we have to understand that not everyone wants to start a business, nor should they. Yeah. Right? Yeah. But all humans have within them this desire to connect with their environment, to create something useful, to be engaged in their work, to have a voice over what they're doing, and to look for opportunities, right?
And so it's interesting that you've also said that the educator, the teacher, does not necessarily have had to have been an entrepreneur in order to teach that. And it comes to what you're saying, because you're not teaching this young person how to actually start the business. You're teaching them how to solve a problem or recognize an opportunity.
Correct. So let's back that one up for 1 second, Yogi. I think, in education, what we're trying to do is bring the younger generation into the logic of the present, right? And we're doing a reasonably good job of that. But what we're not doing well is saying to the younger generation, look, here's the logic of the present, but it's kind of messed up. And we need you to find the areas that can be improved. We're steeped in it, and we can't see what you can see with fresh eyes. So we need you to sort of look for the areas that can be improved, right? And this requires some humility on behalf of the educator, right? To sort of relinquish your control or your power as the knower of the way things are.
And to become a learner in the process as well.
So let's use that for a starting point, right? And so we have to make these assumptions that young people are capable of identifying and solving problems and seeing what we can't see, right? So there's a sort of a beginning premise for this this idea. And then let's combine that with what we talked about a moment ago, Yogi, in that entrepreneurship is a discovery process, right? Requires discovery skills. And these are skills that anyone can learn to develop, the teacher or the student. They're skills that we've just historically undervalued or overlooked. in an industrial sort of zeitgeist or a paradigm. We really didn't value those skills in our systems of education, right? So what I'm getting to is this. If the teacher is acknowledging, look, I don't know what you're going to discover. So the role is different. The teacher is no longer playing the role of a subject matter expert. They play the role of the coach, of the guide, of the encourager or the enabler, not the person that's delivering the knowledge. I mean, how do you instruct someone to discover? Right? You don't really know what they're going to discover, where they're going to discover it.
Yeah. Right? But over the years, the space that with all the disruption and innovation in all different sectors, a sector that hasn't really had a fundamental disruption has been education.
Yeah.
Right? If you look at the way, even though classrooms might become more interactive, but essentially there's still the sage on the stage, there's still the kind of power dynamic. There isn't really this kind of facilitation process that you're talking about, which would require then a fundamental mind shift right now. Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be the big challenge, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the evidence is abundantly clear that education will play a role in shaping mindsets, right? And it's a little bit disturbing that I mean, when you look at the rate of change and complexity that's happening in the world, right? The fact that, at least speaking from a U.S. perspective, the subject of entrepreneurship is virtually absent from the K-12 system, from the public school system altogether is very, very disturbing. And the consequences of ignoring this will only increase, right? So we're still educating young people with these core assumptions that they're going to work in an established organization where the useful thing, whatever that is, has already been determined by someone else.
Yes.
And so that the student is going to be expected to fulfill a predetermined, well-defined role. I mean, so these are deeply held, collective mindset, if you will, the culture of a learning organization of schools. And that's what's got to change. Because the reality is the students are going to have to learn how to function in an environment where no one knows what the useful thing is. And there's no one there to tell them what to do. Right? So the industrial era assumptions in our school system that are so deeply embedded are that the student will work in a highly stable, other-directed environment, which ironically is the experience the teacher is having.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
He or she is working in a highly stable, controlled environment, controlled by others. The reality of it is everyone else is going to have to function in a highly unstable, self-controlled environment. And that's really the flip that needs to happen.
Yeah. You know what's interesting for me in listening to you is it's like we usually think about this entrepreneurial mindset and you and ourselves working in this space, we're talking about it, or the start of our conversation is on the individual level, on the level of the individual.
Right.
But actually, schools need to have an entrepreneurial mindset, countries need to have this entrepreneurial mindset. They're all governed, in a sense, by these individuals who themselves are caught up in a system.
Correct.
And so the elements of what you teach, facilitate, talk about all over the world, and that we work on with young people in our system needs to be applied on a much broader level.
Right.
And they have applicability, in a sense, on all levels. I mean, you need a government person to be entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, that's a really good point, Yogi. I mean, and I'm not advocating for anarchy, right? Yeah. It's not like, okay, throw the rule book out the window and everybody just do what they want. I'm not advocating for that. Yeah. But what I am advocating for is that, everyone needs this new set of tools in their toolbox, right? And I think what the world needs to understand, what educators need to understand, what policymakers need to understand, is that the attitudes, behaviors, and skills required to discover to discover an opportunity are distinct from the attitudes, behaviors, and skills required to exploit that opportunity.
Yes.
Right? And historically, we've just ignored the attitudes, behaviors, and skills that are required to discover.
Right.
Right? So we need discovery skills as well as delivery, or delivery skills is maybe a better way to say it, right? We're really good at teaching young people delivery.
Yeah.
We're not so good at teaching them discovery.
And that's a really important distinction. If you look at one of the international studies on entrepreneurship, the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor said that South Africa punches way below its weight in terms of opportunity recognition. And that's just as compared to other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So here's a country that is, one would say, has a more diversified and sophisticated economy on the continent, and yet, as compared to its peers, are actually underperforming in terms of its young people recognizing opportunities and feeling like they can. So with that in mind, do you really think entrepreneurship can be taught?
Yeah, we hear that question a lot, right? And I look at this idea, as I said a moment ago, from sort of a behavioral phenomenon rather than a business discipline, right? So what I've come to understand, Yogi, is that non-entrepreneurial behavior is learned. Right? So it just sort of flips the question upside down.
Yes, yeah.
As I said a moment ago, not everyone wants to start a business, nor should they. But we all have an innate desire for autonomy, for competency, and for relatedness. And what that means is we all have a desire to have some say over our life, to be engaged in some kind of work to solve problems, to see our work impact others around us, and to see our efforts leading towards something more meaningful and prosperous for ourselves. I mean, these are basic human needs, and these are the conditions within which humans flourish and thrive, right?
Yeah.
So I just think that that's the better way to think about it, is that, I'm working on a new book, and what I've written is that, we've been entrepreneuring for at least 150,000 years, right? I mean, there's evidence from the Paleolithic era that we were exchanging tools and food and furs with other tribes as a survival mechanism. We've only been employees for a few hundred years.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And it's also interesting to me that the word entrepreneur, the word entrepreneur arose at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, when, for the first time in human history, we needed a word that would make the distinction between the person who organized the work and the person who did the work. Because prior to that, we didn't really have a need for that word. Yeah. Right? And I'm sort of arguing that the need for that distinction should go away.
Yeah. Do you think the education system is what is currently in its current form is what is taking that natural or inherent entrepreneurship or entrepreneurial quality away from us?
Well, I mean, I think, the education system is inextricably linked to sort of cultural values and beliefs, right? So you just can't 100% lay it on the feet of education, but but yes, I mean, we're teaching kids to memorize things. We're teaching rote memorization, standardized testing. This doesn't really encourage people to develop entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills, which are just very, very different from that.
Yeah. So that's a good segue into my next question, which is, what are the skills we should then be teaching the youth to deal with this rapidly changing context and environment, and a future that's unpredictable. What are those skills we should be teaching?
Yeah. So, the way I would answer that, Yogi, is rather than starting the conversation about the skills, I would say, let's go back to the definition. Let's teach people how to pursue opportunity, right? Which means, so in the entrepreneurial realm, problems are opportunities. And sort of this core assumption of the entrepreneurial minded is that by solving problems for other people, I can empower myself, right? And what we see is, so when we allow young people to identify and solve problems that they care about, they will naturally begin to develop curiosity, creativity, critical thinking, communication, resilience, resourcefulness, and on and on and on. So the skills, I think about it like this. The skills should ensue. Now, we should not pursue the actual skills, but engage young people in discovery. And by doing so, they will develop the skills. And by the way, when you look at those skills that I just named, the creativity, critical thinking, communication, collaboration, all of these 21st century skills, those are the skills that the OECD, the World Economic Forum, every academic thought leader in the world has said, United Nations, whomever, those are the skills that the workforce will demand. Right? They're the very same skills. Those are the very skills that they're not calling them entrepreneurial skills, they call them soft skills. Which in my view sort of diminishes the impact of that. But I forgot who it was that said happiness, I think it was Viktor Frankl. He said, happiness cannot be pursued, it must ensue. And I think it's the same way about these skills. If you try to teach, critical thinking over here and communication, that's sort of disparate. It's very difficult to sort of weave this together in a context. But I think that's the way educators, think of it as these individual skills.
So I mean, we've been talking about this entrepreneurial mindset without sort of really breaking down the elements of what is an entrepreneurial mindset. And you mentioned a few of those elements just now, those attributes. And so I'd really like to hear from you. What have you seen, discovered, learned are entrepreneurial mindset attributes, and are they different between males and females?
Yeah, so, I don't know if I can speak to the male-female thing, right? But I think that empathy is a very important sort of the secret weapon of the entrepreneur. And I think women are much better at that than men are. Right? But let me step one step back, Yogi, and talk about, the entrepreneurial mindset, right? So what is the mindset? In a simple definition, these are deeply held, mostly unconscious beliefs and tacit assumptions that influence our behavior, right? And we need to understand that our mindset is acquired slowly, subtly, over a long period of time, mostly without our conscious awareness. Right? So this happens largely through social learning, right? And from the time you're very young, you're kind of put into this system that starts to prepare you to be an employee-minded person, right? So when we see an entrepreneurial-minded person, she looks like just an anomaly, right? And so, but the one thing I wanted to say that what I've found, I've interviewed hundreds of entrepreneurs now around the world, and there seems to be this core assumption, and it's mostly tacit, which is, as I said a moment ago, the idea that it's up to me to figure out how to make myself useful to my fellow human, right? And this is a basic assumption, and once we begin to operate on this assumption, we quickly realize, well, there's many ways I can make myself useful. So, I think of entrepreneurship as sort of the search for the intersection of my own interests and abilities and the needs of my fellow human. What am I interested in? What do I like to do? What am I good at? And how can I make myself useful to other humans with that skill, right? And so if we sort of posit this as a core assumption, you have two identical individuals, clones, and one of them goes to work in a controlled, corporate type environment, and the other is out in the world trying to figure out how to make herself useful, to the world. Your mindset will just develop differently. You won't notice a difference in a week or a month or a year, but over 10 or 20 years, it's very, very different. The mind, the brain will evolve very, very differently. And when we see this, we think, oh, you must have been born with some unique traits. And that's something I kind of want to insert into this conversation, is that most people look at entrepreneurs, the ones that you see in the media, successful entrepreneurs, and leap to this conclusion that they must have been born with some unique hereditary disposition, right?
The whole entrepreneurs are born, not made.
And this is not even a conscious assumption, but I think most of the world operates on that premise, which social psychologists refer to this as the fundamental attribution error, right? So we're assigning the wrong cause to the effect. We're overemphasizing the importance of an individual's traits, and we're ignoring the social, environmental, and situational factors.
Absolutely.
By ignoring those factors, we continue to create entrepreneurs by accident rather than by design, right? And so, my message is this, Yogi, to the individual. Look, you have to figure out how to be more innovative and entrepreneurial, right? Regardless of the environment you're in. The boss doesn't support it, okay, you have to find a way around that, right? You have to find a way in the margins to make yourself more useful in whatever situation you find yourself, right? And by the way, I've seen this work in maximum security prisons. So
when the circumstances can be like really against you, when you have no sort of resources.
This is what my first book was about, right? Who Owns the Ice House? Right? It's about it's about an African American in the Mississippi Delta, in the Jim Crow South, when he's not allowed in the bank. He doesn't have basic civil rights. Yet he's the only one in his community that owns 5 businesses and has money in the bank. Right? So I'm saying to the individual, look, you need to find a way to make yourself more useful to more people, regardless of the environment you're in. At the same time, I'm saying to business leaders, community stakeholders, policymakers, look, we have to stop lamenting the lack of engagement in our students, the lack of engagement in our employees. And we have to look within and examine the systems we've created and the extent to which those systems inhibit the development of entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills. The extent to which those systems, Deming said, every system is perfectly designed to create the outcomes it's creating, right? So we have to, it's only then will we recognize this vast reservoir of human potential that's right beneath our feet that we're not getting to. Right? Because of this industrial era way of thinking that's so embedded in our culture that we can't even see it.
So that's, that leads nicely into what do, for example, academic institutions need to do differently to provide that support, that supportive kind of ecosystem or environment within. So we work very closely with schools and universities. If you had to give them some advice and not just about, you know, how do we have market days and, you know, like try and again do what you referenced earlier, is like sort of just put entrepreneurship or entrepreneurial thinking in the same box as starting a business. But if we had to look at it in this more expansive way, what do you think academic institutions should do differently?
Wow, that's a big question, Yogi. You know, I think first we need to recognize, as I said, that the world has changed in ways that now require all students. They're going to need to learn how to develop entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills. You know, I'll say it differently. You know, learning how to think like an entrepreneur will make you future-proof, right? And so policymakers need to understand this cause and effect correlation between the ways in which our schools continue to produce employee-minded individuals and the extent to which they're discouraging the development of entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills, which is to say that they're underutilizing this massive human capital. Right, so that's on a micro or a macro scale. I mean, I think that's where we have to start that conversation. Right, we're creating innovators and entrepreneurs by accident, not by design. And I think that's based on this fundamental assumption that the entrepreneurs seem to have been born with some kind of unique ability, and everybody else will go be an employee. Right? Look at the gig economy. I mean, look at on the flight here, I was reading a McKinsey report on you know, AI and robotics and so forth, right? And I mean, the general consensus, and I'm sure you've read many similar things, is that, you know, at least in the near future, robots aren't going to take all our jobs, right? But there's going to be so much transition. They're going to change our jobs radically, and there's this massive, you know, tsunami of change that's coming. That, you know, from people in the existing workforce, to say nothing of students who are in school now and will face, you know, this rate of change and complexity, constantly having to reinvent themselves.
I mean, I think that's a whole conversation on its own. Just, you know, that kind of future proofing, because we're thinking deeply about that, and I think what's important, as you said, is that it's not done sort of with trying to just teach separate skills that are not in context in a sense. So I think my question then is, how does an educator or a school principal or a university vice chancellor spread this culture when they themselves are a product of the education system that has taught differently, that has been, you know, and it's sometimes, you know, one could argue, so have you and I and other people who work in the space, but it's almost like, how do you, those might be the outliers, how do you get this larger group of people to actually understand what this concept is, what it means, why this future-proofing is important, so it doesn't become just something that we speak about, you know, over the dinner table, but it actually manifests within the schools, within universities.
That's a big question, and I got my first sort of response to that was on a macro perspective, and how on a micro perspective, you know, I've spent the last 8 years training educators, doing, you know, professional development, the Ice House Entrepreneurial Mindset programs. We've trained about 2,100 teachers from 5 continents. And what we see, Yogi, that's so exciting is when the teachers are exposed to this entrepreneurial discovery process, they themselves become impacted, right? And so that's sort of our strategy, is as Trojan horse, is to impact the individual teachers and sort of help them understand how to cultivate these opportunity discovery skills in their students. That, you know, they'll begin to change the way they operate in the classroom. Now, the teachers are constrained by the incentive structures, so we have to have that conversation as well. And, you know, another way to think about this is this idea from Jaime Casap at Google Education. And, you know, he said, let's stop asking students what they want to be when they grow up.
Yes.
And start asking them what problems do they want to solve, and what do they need to learn in order to solve the problems.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I
And
love that.
I think that, I mean, it sounds, that's a subtle shift that changes everything. Right? The underlying assumptions underneath that comment are very different from, you know, what do you want to be when you grow up? Which is sort of the assumption that you're going to work in an established organization. You're going to fit into the world as it is.
Yeah.
You're going to do as you're expected.
Yeah.
And collect your paycheck and, you know, get a pension and go home and forget about it. I mean,
Yeah.
I think we really, really need to get to some of these underlying assumptions, you know. Again, when we think of it as a business discipline, there's a bounded rationality. And when we look at, Yogi, when you look at what entrepreneurs, they contribute to our communities, to society as a whole, right? These are like highly resilient, resourceful, hyper-engaged individuals who are able to identify and solve problems in resource-constrained circumstances. No one's there to tell them what to do. No one's coming to the rescue. The rules aren't clear. The path is not well defined, right? Excuse me. And not only are they very well prepared, the best prepared to adapt and thrive in a rapidly changing world, but they're prepared to make a greater contribution to the organizations within which they work and the communities within which they live, their families, right? They're greater contributors to society.
Yeah.
Right? But we just sort of ignore them and toss them off as if there's something unusual about them that we can't quite figure out. We need to make that correlation between these deeply held societal beliefs about what an individual is capable of.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We need to really look at, excuse me, we really need to look at the social, environmental, and situational factors that either encourage or diminish or depress the development of entrepreneurial skills.
So I mean that brings me to kind of move away maybe from the sort of the academic institutions and that side of things. That it brings me to almost the examples of entrepreneurs out there to aspire to and role modeling. And so if we're going to almost redefine this thing about being entrepreneurial, etc., but you've only got these role models of a Mark Zuckerberg, Steve Jobs, create big things. If you can't come up with something innovative, basically you don't fit that definition. Then role modeling is one of those things that's really important. And I think role modeling, not just from the point of view of the type of entrepreneur, the type of entrepreneurial person, but other factors like the almost the demographic profile, the ethnicity or race or gender or culture or what religious profile of this entrepreneur, and really understanding. And in a country like South Africa, this is really important because the study that I referenced that I did in townships that I mentioned to you earlier with women entrepreneurs, and they said, some of them said to me, so I'm running this business, and when it starts getting sort of too successful, I'll hand it over to a man, because only then will it really grow. Because the idea I have of a successful business person is male.
Right.
So if I want this business to really grow, I really need to step away and give it to a man to run it, which I thought was fascinating. And again, goes to this role modeling. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, let's start with the role modeling, right? So that's a huge problem And so we know from social psychology that without relatable social models, we're unlikely to adapt a new behavior, right? And I think it's important to point out, Yogi, that when we're asking someone to be entrepreneurial, we're asking them to deviate from societal norms, right? So let's start with that premise, which sort of wreaks havoc on our psyches for most of us, right? We're just sort of, we're from an evolutionary psychological perspective, we're kind of hardwired to conform to the group as a survival mechanism. And so let's start with that premise, right? So it's hard for everybody to deviate, right? We're asking people to deviate from the norm. So, and then we put forth these, so, I'm fond of saying that there's sort of this, what's the word I'm looking for? So visibility versus representation issue, right? The Mark Zuckerbergs, the Elon Musks, they make headlines. But they're not representative. In our work, as you know, I've been going around the world interviewing the underdog entrepreneurs. And that's where my, interest lies in how do people that don't have big ideas, that don't have access to venture capital, they're not at Stanford or the Ivy League. How do people, ordinary people, who have no particular advantage in life at all, manage to be innovative and entrepreneurial, right? And so this is some of the work we did in the research we did at Kauffman at the Cisco and at the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute, is to sort of tease out this visibility versus representation issue. So I'll give you an example. In the U.S., there's about 400,000 new businesses created each year. Like a tiny fraction of 1% are funded with venture capital, right? So these, so in the media, in the public domain, these examples we see of entrepreneurship are a fraction of a single percent that make it to the level of media, and it skews our thinking, not only about who can be an entrepreneur, but how to be entrepreneurial, right? So I'm not from Stanford. I don't have any technology. I can't imagine something, right? So I'm not even going to try. I'm going to go to my job and just try to suffer through the whole thing, right? And what we've looked at is what are the common beliefs, behaviors, and circumstances of the everyday underdog entrepreneur? How do you create the conditions that cultivate that underdog entrepreneur, right? So, but also from the social relatable model thing I want to get back to now, if you think Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk, most people, that'll just prevent you from ever starting in the first place, right? And then what I wanted to come back to is, so we need to put forth the everyday entrepreneur, right? We need to do more to showcase, because they're everywhere. They're in townships, they're in big cities, they're here in South Africa, they're in South Bend, Indiana. I mean, right? They're in rural communities, small communities, big cities, whatever. And I, will say, Yogi, when you look at these everyday underdog entrepreneurs, there is something really fascinating happening that is more or less being ignored. And so, but coming back to the women in the township situation, the entrepreneurial mindset, I think of it like this. Culture is a collective mindset, and individually we have a mindset, and those two things are inextricably linked, right? And you can't really, they sort of bend back on each other. As individual agents, we influence our culture, and at the same time, we are influenced by our culture, right? So the question is, to what extent are we influenced by the culture, right? And so when women don't see, like you said, in the township situation, they don't see any example of a woman-run business beyond a certain level, they're probably not even making that decision consciously half the time, right? It's just like, okay, this is time for me to hand it off, right?
So obviously, then the logical thing to do is to ensure that there are more role models out there that are representative. And this goes to each of us in our various ways that we could do that. Besides us as a foundation being involved with this work, so could the media, so could other organizations, so could schools, and government in its various interactions, corporates, etc. So over and above these role models, what do you think needs to be done to create this collective, now the collective side of the culture, the societal culture of entrepreneurial thinking and entrepreneurial mindsets?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, Yogi. I think it starts by we have to, policymakers need to understand the extent to which our systems of education, our organizational structures, either deliberately or otherwise, dampen or inhibit the development of entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills. We need to look at it as a behavioral phenomenon, understand that we're doing this we're creating innovators and entrepreneurs by accident rather than by design. I mean, we have to start there. It's not, it's not the genetic predisposition. It's not some random thing. It's not, it's not a random occurrence that's just happening.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it has to start there. Right? But I think so. There's a couple other things we can do. We need to promote the success of the underdog entrepreneurs, right, and recognize the mindset of the everyday underdog entrepreneur, and put those success stories out in the world. So, for the Women Township examples you gave me, I'm sure that if you look hard enough, you're going to find some women entrepreneurs that have transcended that sort of threshold, right? They're there somewhere, right? Maybe it's a tiny minority, but find them, right? Yeah. And start to find the common patterns and what they, how did they overcome these self-imposed, these culturally imposed limitations.
What I really like, and sorry to backtrack, but what I really like about the Ice House story is that it doesn't just look at an entrepreneur who even is on almost like the same level of you. Like when you read that story, you're not even looking at somebody who's had the same level of education. You're looking at someone or you're reading the story of somebody who really had it bad. They had really adverse circumstances and condition, and they've risen above that to do it in their way, and to grow, in a way that was very successful at the time and for him. And I thought that was interesting. What instigated this work for you? What brought you to that point of realizing that that was an important story to be told?
Yeah, that's a great question, Yogi. I've always looked at entrepreneurship. I mean, I started on this journey in 1991, and trying to deconstruct the mindset of the everyday entrepreneur, thinking to myself that entrepreneurs learn to see the world differently, and if I could somehow sort of deconstruct the mindset of the entrepreneur, this could be useful to other people. And not just useful for people that want to start a business, you understand, but useful in a much broader context. There's an empowered way of thinking here that I couldn't quite really understand when I first started. And I began to interview entrepreneurs, and as I began to recognize the commonality in their beliefs, their behavior, their circumstances, and then I began to turn to the literature in psychology and social and behavioral sciences to understand this, but I always saw it as an empowerment, as a framework for thinking that can empower an individual regardless of her circumstances, right? And So in 2007, I was hired by the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute in San Jose, California, to do a gap analysis on the entrepreneurship education ecosystem in the US. And very quickly, we discovered, I came to this very quickly, the idea that the way entrepreneurship is being portrayed in the classroom is largely divorced from the day-to-day reality of what a typical entrepreneur is actually doing.
Yeah.
Right? There was just almost a complete disconnect. And we started to find a lot of research showing that even large successful companies are started by inexperienced founders that aren't doing much planning. They're not spending a lot of time writing a business plan. They're not spending a lot of time doing market research. They don't have a lot of money. They don't have a lot of experience.
Yeah.
Right? And so you can't explain this with a business plan and a financial forecast and a venture capitalist, because the vast majority of businesses aren't really starting that way.
Yeah.
Right? So when we recognized this, then we went out to say, okay, first of all, we recognized there's no curriculum anywhere that even remotely explains how does an inexperienced, unfunded entrepreneur recognize and bring to life an opportunity. There's no curriculum.
Yeah.
Right? And so we began to interview entrepreneurs, right? The underdog entrepreneurs. How is the typical entrepreneur doing this? And I met Clifton Talbert in 2007 on this interview series we're doing in the U.S. initially. And when he explained that, Mr. Talbert is a very successful entrepreneur in many endeavors. He's written a dozen books, nominated for the Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, his first book was one of the first books Nelson Mandela requested when he was released from prison.
Oh, wow.
Clifton's first book was Once Upon a Time When We Were Colored. And he got a letter from Mandela asking for a copy of his book. So Mr. Talbert is a very successful entrepreneur.
Yeah.
And so when I asked Mr. Talbert, like, how did you learn how to think like an entrepreneur? He explained to me that he was born in this very poor cotton community. He's African American. He was born in this little community in 1945, born to a teenage mother, didn't know a father. And he was picking cotton. He was working in the cotton fields since he was a little boy. He said this was the expected way of life.
Yeah.
The field truck came. And this was the social norm.
Yeah.
The field truck came, you got on the field truck, and you went out in the field and you picked cotton. And he said, this was what I was doing since I was a little boy. I was normalized into this way of life. And he said, when I was 13 years old, I went to work for my uncle, Uncle Cleve, who happened to own the local ice house.
Uncle Cleve, yes.
And he described Uncle Cleve, as having a very rudimentary education, maybe 4th or 5th grade. He had a very rudimentary education. They weren't allowed in the bank, but every 2 weeks he would drive into the next town and go into the bank. They had to go in the back door, but he put his money in the bank. And so I just really was captivated by this story, and I used it to try to articulate the simplicity of entrepreneurship. It's deceptively simple. And that's what I was trying to and I was a little bit trying to push against sort of the Silicon Valley ideal of the entrepreneur as a genius, as somebody, some young whiz kid, and he comes up with an idea and venture capital, writing millions of dollars and just kind of push away from that and try to help people understand this basic fundamental concepts. And to my, delight and surprise, there are people all over the world now learning about entrepreneurship sort of through the lens of Uncle Cleve. And I want to come back to something that you sort of, hinted around, Yogi, which is, what we find in the entrepreneurial domain that's so exciting to me is that it sort of turns adversity on its head. Right? I mean, and if we do this right, we can transform adversity into an advantage. I found a study recently that showed 400 major contributors to the 20th century. The criteria for this was you had to have 2 biographies written about you. Right? So that's that qualifies you as a major contributor. And I think that they said that 75% of this 400 people in the survey 75% said they came from sustained childhood adversity. And 15% reported episodic childhood adversity. And only 10% said no real adversity whatsoever.
Yeah.
Right? And this is what I keep hearing from the entrepreneur underdog. They're saying, you know, I came from this hardship, but they're interpreting that hardship optimistically.
Yes.
They're saying, you know, it wasn't fun, it wasn't pleasant, but it made me who I am. It taught me to be strong, it taught me to be resilient. So they're optimistically interpreting it.
Yeah.
What we know from the literature is that people who learn to optimistically interpret adversity become happier, healthier, and stronger than people who've never suffered adversity in the first place.
Yeah.
That, to me, is the most exciting aspect of entrepreneurial mindset education.
And it's fascinating, and I think just this on its own, we could speak for a while on it. But this future orientation in the midst of that adversity.
Yeah.
Because you could get two people who are in that adverse circumstance or situation and interpret it very differently. But someone with that future orientation that believes that this is not permanent, that this is something I can get myself out of, and has that future orientation, is the one that often does.
That's right. That's exactly right. So thank you for that question, because you're providing me with an opportunity to explain what I'm now calling the entrepreneurial mindset theory, right? So in a nutshell, if you want to understand why the entrepreneur is so resilient, so resourceful, so creative, so curious, so hyper engaged, right? Self-directed, all of these attributes, right? I would say stop looking at the individual's hereditary traits and look at the nature of the goal she is pursuing and her relationship to that goal.
Right.
Right? And that's where the answers lie, right? So, but to your point, you know, one of the common things we sort of teased out of hundreds of interviews, what distinguishes the entrepreneur from the non-entrepreneur is so deceptively simple, Yogi, and it's this. Do you have a compelling goal? Right? Because if you, and the other part of the question is, if you don't, why not? Right?
Yeah.
But when you listen, when you interview the entrepreneur, they'll start to articulate something very compelling on the horizon they're trying to accomplish. It may be to escape something very uncomfortable or unpleasant, or it might be to approach something that's very compelling, right? But what, you know, the psychologist Philip Zimbardo at Stanford, known for the Stanford prison experiments, has written a book about this, about the time paradox, right?
Yes.
I've seen other studies that when they look at people that have gotten themselves out of poverty in a single generation, the common denominator is a future positive orientation. So let's go back to the mindset, right? When you set out to pursue something compelling in the future, you're not aware of this, but it's orienting you towards the future being positive, as opposed to someone for whom the future is anxious, or unpleasant, or just the same as the present, right? You know, so what Zimbardo teaches us, you can have a future positive orientation, you can have a future anxious or negative, you can have a present hedonistic, right, just seeking pleasure, you can have a past regret, or you can have a past nostalgia orientation. And this deeply held time orientation has an enormous effect on our behavior. So all that is to say, the distinguishing factor between the entrepreneur and the non-entrepreneur is she's got a compelling goal, something on the horizon she's trying to accomplish, right? And you know, we can talk about what makes a goal compelling,
Yeah.
right? But
We need another 3 days for that.
we need another 3 days for that, correct. But, suffice it to say that, most of us are still operating on sort of this behaviorist ideal that motivation comes from outside of the individual in the form of
The
carrots and sticks.
extrinsic, yeah, versus the
And we
intrinsic.
know that's not true,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
still most of the world still functions with punishment and reward, right? And the entrepreneur is more likely to be intrinsically motivated because the goal they're pursuing is intrinsically motivating, intrinsically rewarding.
So Gary, thank you so much for this time. I find all of this fascinating, and what's been great for us is how aligned the foundation and Eli are on these matters of the entrepreneurial mindset. And I can say that the session, the workshop that you invited me to was one of the most captivating I've ever attended, and I've said this to you in person as well. So I think anybody who has the chance to should attend it, because as much as we're in this space and we work with the same subject matter, I think that you have a nuance in how you bring it to life. And so thank you for that, and thank you for joining us. It's, as always, conversations between us are very fun and interesting and always insightful. So thank you. Thank you for
Yogi.
joining us.
It's really a great pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you.